Hello, my name is Pat Dudgeon. I'm presenting on behalf of myself, Dr. Dawn Darlaston-Jones, Professor Sabine Harmon, and Dr. Joanne Alexi. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about one of our projects called the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project. And we'll be talking about community of practices and decolonising the curriculum. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land which we meet on, and whichever land we're meeting on. I'm actually in beautiful Noongar country, and I'd like to acknowledge our elders past, present and emerging, and elders of other countries. I'd like to acknowledge and respect the continuing culture, strength and resilience of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. And I'd like to acknowledge and recognise the support and strength of our allies. Before I start talking about what we've been doing in decolonising psychology curriculum, I'd like to just briefly mention Aboriginal Australia. And usually when I talk about Indigenous issues, I do a history lesson, but just to, this is a very small version, just to acknowledge that there are, Aboriginal Australia is made up of a diversity of different populations. There were over 250 different language groups across the country that made up Aboriginal Australia. We also have Torres Strait Islander people who are part of our Indigenous population. So to recognise our diversity right across the country. But basically today I'll be talking about the history of the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project, AIPEP, the outcomes of the first AIPEP, the current psychology workforce, and our own research project where AIPEP 2 is located under, and how we've gone about doing AIPEP 2. And then there will be questions later on. But basically, the history of AIPEP is that prior to AIPEP, there was little or no Indigenous content in psychology higher education. And if there was, it was very much from a colonial standpoint, and it was deficit focused. But the impact of this has, the outcomes of this has impacted on students. So there were very few students because the content wasn't relevant, it was not translatable, and also to non-Indigenous students because there was a lack of cultural responsiveness and knowledge. So that absence has really impacted upon our discipline area. However, AIPEP was funded in response to this underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in psychology and the lack of cultural responsiveness in the curriculum. And I led that with a number of researchers from different universities back in the day. Some of this is, I think 2013, the project started and ended in 2016. And the outcomes of the first AIPEP included that we did 3 major reports, and that was an AIPEP curriculum framework. You will be given this PowerPoint and links to where all this resource is. And that was a report that looked at ways to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and content in undergraduate and postgraduate psychology training. Another outcome was guidelines for increasing the recruitment, retention and graduation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students. And again, that it is what it says, that it was about trying to get more Indigenous students into psychology. And our third report was the AIPEP workforce capabilities, which gave graduate and professional development of our current workforce, so people could work in a culturally responsive way with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. The big issue for us though was that cultural responsiveness was included as a new standard in the APAC 2019 standards. So we were very well placed when we started AIPEP 2. So The AIPEP project is really important because Indigenous psychologists are very few in our discipline area, and that needs to be one of our aims. So we know that in June 2020, the number of Australian psychologists was around 40,000. That has been an increase, but we know that only 0.7% or 284 of psychologists were Indigenous. So if the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population is 3.3%, we need at least a parity amount. And so a further 1,053 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander psychologists are needed just to gain parity. So one of our big targets is to increase the number of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander psychologists. And we know that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students are more likely to choose psychology as a career path if Indigenous knowledges are included into the curriculums. So to encourage participation and to build a culturally responsive psychological workforce, it's critical that the content is culturally relevant to meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities, including students and consumers. So just briefly to give the AIPEP 2 a bit of context, it is actually part of a bigger project that is called the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing Project. That's an NHMRC Million Minds project with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of researchers looking at transforming Indigenous mental health and wellbeing for Indigenous people. Important elements of that is there's Indigenous leadership. We have authentic partnerships with our community organisations, and we're developing a paradigm of social and emotional wellbeing that centres the role of culture in health, mental health. So we have 3 research streams, and I'll just go over those very briefly. AIPEP is part of empowering the workforce. You will be given these slides and references after as part of my presentation. So please read up on our work. It's very interesting. We're particularly proud of our genuine partners that we have with the Aboriginal, particularly with the Aboriginal sector, and as you can see, we have the Australian Indigenous psychologists as part of our grant, Healing Foundation, NACCHO, and so on. Have a squizzy. This is some of our team, and the people who are involved in AIPEP are myself, Joanne Alexi, Belle Selleck, and Dawn Darlaston Jones, and Sabine Harmon. So their pictures are on our activities as well. Okay, just talking a little bit about the second iteration of AIPEP, or AIPEP 2. We are working in partnership with higher education providers to implement the findings from the first iteration of AIPEP. And we're doing that through a community of practice. So higher education providers and those particularly with who are actively course controllers and involved in doing some Indigenous studies in their programs have been invited to be a part of our community of practice. But so it might be that they're doing building capacity and support for curriculum transformations, or they might be doing activities and or to support Indigenous students. But we're pretty excited that 28 universities nationwide have signed up. So once we put out the call, it was amazing that people were very keen to be involved, and we're very proud of that. We will be scoping and evaluating psychology education, so more getting a list of what people are doing in the different universities, and there's some really great things happening across the board. We also will be working with key stakeholders in AIPEP 2. So we have an executive stakeholder advisory group, and that includes APS, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, APAC, the Psychology Board of Australia, APRA, and HODSPA. So we have a great executive group who are also very keen to see change happening. Just talking about the development of the community of practice, we know from AIPEP 1 that cultural responsiveness was incorporated in the new APAC accreditation standards in 2019, and this actually prompted action from higher education providers. So the community of practice began with 10 partner higher education providers, and these were heads of school, course conveners, lecturers, those who are interested in embedding Indigenous knowledges and supporting Indigenous students. HODSPA on our behalf sent a letter to higher education providers inviting them to join AIPEP 2, the community of practice. And our numbers doubled, more than double with that letter of invitation. So we were particularly impressed with the great enthusiasm that resulted from the announcement of AIPEP 2. Some of the outcomes of the community of practice have been that we meet regularly, we meet on a monthly basis, and different, we do our business, and then we'll have a provider might share what they're doing in their university, or we'll have topic issues. So we are building capacity through ongoing sharing and topic discussions on the meaning of decolonisation in psychology, supporting Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander student recruitment, retention and graduation, and curriculum development examples of best practice. So, and we'll be putting that online. We are upskilling psychology professionals and students via online APS webinars. So for instance, we've had topics like trauma-informed care and culture, sharing online resources. So we have a website and a mailing list, and one-to-one support with higher education providers. So in consultation with UWA School of Psychological Science and Yarning Circle to assist, so we've undertaken that to assist with curriculum transformations within the school. So because we are located at UWA. Just to finish, I'd like to just show you our website and invite others to visit it. We made a decision as a group that our website was open, so we've upgraded, refreshed and revitalised the old website and have a pretty awesome website now. So please visit us, visit our website and look at our resources. Part of our aim for AIPEP 2 is to have a clearinghouse of resources that are useful for people who are wanting to put Indigenous studies into their curriculum, wanting to know how to support Indigenous students and so on. If you have an idea of some resources that is not already on the website, contact us, email us and tell us. So this is for all of us in the psychology area, and it will prove to be a great resource. And on that note, I'd like to just say that do follow us. We do have a Twitter account for transforming Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. Another of our bodies that we are responsible for is the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention. So do have a squizzy at our website and follow us in social media. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you and open up now for discussion and questions. But thank you.